none of them wound up entering the contest to replace him. Instead, it mostly wound up being a two-person race between Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland, neither of whom were current members of the Trudeau administration at all. Which was probably a good thing for the party, because it guaranteed that whoever became the new prime minister would have some degree of distance from Trudeau himself, which was obviously useful given Mark Carney was treated as the early frontrunner and was given mostly favorable press that grew increasingly brazen and cocky in declaring just how likely he was to win. The head of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, even started making attack ads against him long before the voting had even started. So yeah, the conventional wisdom in his favor was pretty confident, and I guess it wound up being right in the end. But it was still pretty striking, just given how little hard polling data there was. Voting for the new PM was only open to registered members of the Liberal Party, an amorphous group of a couple 100,000 Canadians that's constantly changing in size, making it quite difficult to identify, let alone poll. In the lead up to the election, the party confirmed that nearly 400,000 registered Liberals have signed up to vote, but in the end, only 150,000 people actually participated, for a turnout rate of 37%, of which Carney won an incredible 86%. I mean, there had been some polls, and Carney had been leading in them, but their reliability was considered low. I actually felt a bit nervous even making this video, which, as you can probably tell, I had to film a few days before the results were even known. I mean, at this point, we've all seen plenty of elections where the supposed safe bet wasn't. But yes, Carney did win, so let's talk about him. Mark Carney is an interesting figure because I feel like he has always been vastly better known to Canadian journalists and pundits and people who follow Canadian politics very, very closely, as opposed to the general public. There was a poll taken back in July in which only 7% of the country knew who he was. By the time of Trudeau's resignation in January, when gossip about Carney's prime ministerial ambitions had been filling the papers for months, that number had skyrocketed to a mighty 24%. And perhaps this is understandable, given that Carney has never been an elected politician or even a guy most Canadians would have ever seen on TV. He has spent most of his life as an investment banker and financial bureaucrat. Educated at Harvard and Oxford, Carney spent over a decade working at the famous international global financial firm Goldman Sachs in Toronto, New York, London, and Tokyo. In 2008, Canada's then Conservative Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, appointed him to be head of the Bank of Canada, Canada's central bank. Carney's tenure in the job was most notable for overlapping with the Great Recession, a global economic crisis that Canada weathered relatively well, presumably at least in some part due to sane monetary policy from the central bank. Prime Minister Harper at the time was certainly eager to give Carney some credit for that, although partisanship being what it is, he has since said that Carney's role was overrated. In any case, it was in the context of the Great Recession and Canada's comparatively high-functioning economy that you first began to read stories that Carney was thinking of maybe making a transition into elected politics. There is some dispute as to whether or not he was seriously considering joining the Conservative Party at this point, but it does seem that Prime Minister Harper was openly courting him. But Carney ultimately did not go into politics, and instead he went into England. In 2013, after his term at the Bank of Canada ended, Carney made a dramatic and controversial decision to leave Canada altogether and move to Great Britain and work for the British government as head of the Bank of England. The idea of a senior Canadian government official swapping his national loyalties this casually was pretty shocking, and Carney got some bad press for it at the time, because it seemed to signal that he was a man ultimately guided by his own ambition rather than loyalty to his birth country. Like most Canadians, I don't really know much about what Carney got up to in England. I feel like it hasn't really been treated as something that's that relevant to his Canadian political career. I understand that he had a sort of tense relationship with the Tory government over there because of his skepticism toward Brexit, and his outspokenness in demanding climate change be factored into economic policy. Noted 5-minute Prime Minister Liz Truss has certainly been going around telling everybody in Canada that he was really terrible. I know that much. But anyway, after his 7-year tenure at the Bank of England ended, Carney began working part-time at the UN on climate stuff, as well as part-time at a big Canadian investment firm, and part-time doing consulting work for the British and Canadian governments. It's quite unclear to me exactly where he was living during this period, given how much he was bouncing around between Canada, the US, and Britain. He's expressed some self-consciousness about this recently, that he's aware that he's sort of a quintessential example of an elitist globalist, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I'm connected, I can deliver for the country, and my weakness is, people will charge me as being elitist or a globalist, to use that term, which is, that's exactly, it happens to be exactly what we need.
Despite omnipresent rumors that Carney was planning an entry into Canadian politics any day now, with him being out of Canada so much after 2013, I actually feel like his profile in this country was relatively low over the last dozen years or so, unless, of course, you were somebody who followed Canadian political news like super closely. I mean, at some point you're judged for what you're actually doing, not what you might do someday, right? And this is relevant because when Trudeau was first starting to look a little bit shaky, the leading candidate to replace him was someone much more high profile. Chrystia Freeland was easily the most famous cabinet minister of the Justin Trudeau era. She was one of the few people who had been in his cabinet since day one and held 4 very important jobs in succession: trade minister, then foreign minister, then finance minister, during which she was also deputy prime minister. Deputy prime minister is kind of a nothing job, but it can carry a lot of symbolic importance in that it shows that the prime minister trusts you enough to take over in a time of crisis. Throughout the course of all of the big things that Trudeau did during his 3 terms in office, Freeland was always there, quite literally, right by his side. Whether it was renegotiating NAFTA with Trump, invoking emergency powers to end the truckers' protest, standing in solidarity with Ukraine, or cajoling Parliament to pass another back-breaking budget, there was Chrystia. As some wags had dubbed her, she truly seemed to be Trudeau's Minister of Everything. And it is for that reason that it came as quite a dramatic shock to the Canadian political world when Freeland resigned from Trudeau's cabinet in rather angry fashion on December 16th, 2024. In a sharply written letter, she said that she had lost faith in Trudeau's capacity to run the economy in a sane and pragmatic way at a time when the freshly re-elected Trump administration was promising to wage brutal economic war on this country in the form of devastating across-the-board tariffs. But this was also her attempt to get in front of the story and define it on her own terms, because it quickly came out that Trudeau had been planning to fire her anyway and replace her with, dun dun dun, Mark Carney. In subsequent interviews, Freeland began to adopt a rather snarky tone when talking about the Prime Minister, implying she felt very personally betrayed after standing loyal to him for so long.
How would you tackle that differently than what the experience you've had was?
Well, probably I wouldn't tell my finance minister I was going to fire her the day after she delivered the fall economic statement. I probably wouldn't say that 3 days before she was supposed to deliver it.
In any case, it was precisely because she had been a trusted Trudeau aide for so long that her resignation was framed by the press as basically representing the moment in which Trudeau's hold on the prime ministership had become unsustainable, and he wound up resigning less than a month later. So you can probably get a sense of how the dynamics of the race to replace Trudeau played out. In theory, both Carney and Freeland were outsiders to the Trudeau administration, but in practice, Carney was the continuity candidate because he was clearly in Trudeau's good graces, while Freeland had become a critic, which was ironic because Freeland had, of course, served in Trudeau's government for 9 years, while Carney had served for 0, but that's politics, baby! The fact that Carney has won the prime ministership, in turn, suggests that there is still a lot of residual loyalty to Trudeau in the Liberal Party, despite his unpopularity, and presumably more Liberals bought into the narrative that Freeland had betrayed Trudeau rather than the other way around. Now, in fairness to Carney, it should be noted that he has put some effort into putting some space between himself and the soon-to-be former prime minister as well. In a debate with Freeland the other day, for instance, it was interesting to hear Carney offer some relatively pointed criticisms of the Trudeau economic record, which actually mirrored some of the things that Trudeau's more conservative critics have been saying. Namely, that what little economic growth Canada had experienced over the last few years hardly reflected anything good about the fundamentals of the Canadian economy.
I want to be clear about the, quote, strength of our economy. Our economy over the last 5 years has been driven